right, so we're starting a series today called Tragic Hero, and it's based on the life of David. So why David? Well, first and foremost, he's in the Bible. When I say that, I'm not being sarcastic. When I say he's in the Bible, I mean he's really in the Bible. There are 59 chapters dedicated to David alone. 150 of the Psalms were written, but not by him. Almost messed that up. 73 of the 150 Psalms that we have were written by David, so that's a lot. He's mentioned in the New Testament no less than 54 times. His is the longest narrative of a single individual that we have anywhere in ancient literature, not just in the Bible, but anywhere in ancient literature. So he's a significant character. But what we're going to learn too as we go through this series is not only is he in the Bible, he's in us. He's a study of contrasts. And there's so many great things we see about him, but so many things that are also words of warning that surround him. So on one hand, he's a man who is a sensitive artist composing music. He's writing poetry. But on the other hand, he is a ferocious warrior. He is, in one moment, a passionate worshiper. Then you turn the page, and he is an adulterous murderer. He was a glimpse of what is the very best in all of us, but he also shows us the shadows of the very worst in all of us. So in a way, there's a little bit of David in every single one of us. And we're going to get into his story. But to understand his story, you have to understand the backdrop of which his story kind of comes from. And sometimes there are lives that are so intertwined. You can't understand one life unless you know a little bit about the other life. And that is the case with David and a man named Saul. And so let's start here. We're going to start in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 16. So the story of David takes place in 1 and 2 Samuel. Verse 1 of chapter 16, the Lord is speaking to Samuel. Samuel is what you would call a prophet. A prophet was someone who heard from God, and he spoke, relaying the messages of God to the people of God. That was his role. And so the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." So David is actually the second king. The first king is a man by the name of Saul. And so we understand David's life against the backdrop of Saul's life. David, in many ways, was the king that Saul should have been, but never was. So let's talk a little bit about Saul. After the Exodus, God's people became really a nation after they left the Egyptian slavery. And they did not yet have a home. They didn't have a land, but they were still God's people. They were still a nation. And for the first 400 years of their existence as a nation of God's people, they did not have a king. And then suddenly the people start looking around at all the other nations, and they realize everybody else has a king. We want a king, right? That's human nature. So they say to Samuel, like, "Give us a king. We want a king. Ask God to give us a king." And Samuel tries to warn them, like, "You don't want a king, right? A king is going to take what's yours. He is going to tax what you work for." He tells them that. And they're like, "We don't care." They refuse to listen. "We want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and to fight our battles." What do we want? We want a king that will fight our battles, right? What do we want? We want safety. We want security. What we're really asking for, you kind of peel back the layers, they're looking for salvation, and they're wanting this man to come in and really save them, right? When the going gets tough, to fight for them, to represent them, and to save them, to bring them safety and security. So they weren't just submitting a request to God for a new king. This was an active rejection of God himself, because God was meant to be their king. They had the chance to show the world something new, something different, something utterly unique, and they didn't do it. Why is that? Well, look what they said. "We want to be like all the other nations." Like, we don't want to be different. We want to be unique. We want what everybody else has, and everybody else has a king. And so it was, in the end, it was just too much for them. They kind of succumbed to the pattern of the world that they saw around them. And Samuel says, "Okay, you can get a king, but here, you got to understand, going into this, eyes wide open, there is always going to be a cost. When you try to manage your own salvation, when you try to create your own safety and your own security through your own methods, there is going to be an unintended cost that comes with that. And it's going to cost you more than he will ever provide you. But they said, well, we don't care. We want a king. And so in response, God gave them Saul. And sometimes we got to remember, here's the first principle today. Sometimes the very, very worst thing that could happen to you is that God gives you exactly what you ask for. Because that's what happens here. We're going to see that even more. Saul was a catastrophic failure as a king, leaving the people worse off than before. And we can look at that and go, well, then why did God choose him? That's a great question. We're going to deal with that question a little bit later. But let's go back to verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. So when we meet Samuel for the first time, he's mourning, he's grieving, he's disappointed over what Saul has become. Saul, we're going to find out, he had great potential, but he never realized that potential. And so now Samuel is mourning over this lost potential of Saul and Saul's failure as a king. And we look at that and we kind of understand it, but we kind of don't, because unlike Samuel, we're used to our leaders letting us down. Right? We're used to our leaders disappointing us. But Samuel, he doesn't understand that. Why? Because this is the first king. This is the first king he's ever had. He's not seen this before. He doesn't know this. We've been caught in this pattern forever, right? Because we're about to do it again. We're coming into an election year, and what happens? We fall for it every single time. We think, well, maybe this guy's the guy. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. It doesn't matter who you vote for. It happens on both sides because both of them, they all come, promising safety, security, prosperity. This is how we're going to do it. And you're thinking, maybe this is the one. Maybe this is the one that will finally make good on the promise. And then we find out that, well, he's just like all the rest. Right? They always leave us in some level. Doesn't matter who they are. They always leave us disappointed in some way. And really, why do we keep doing it? Because we do. We keep electing them. We keep crowning them. We keep finding kings. We want kings and presidents ultimately to give us safety and security and some measure of salvation in this world. And why is that? Because you and I are hardwired for a true king, a real king, a king meant to one day come and to establish real justice and real mercy and real compassion and to set everything right again. And we long for that so deeply that we fall for it every 4 years. So we understand this. And so God says to Samuel, listen, Samuel, quit crying. I'm still in charge. Get your oil, go to Bethlehem, find Jesse. And he says, I have chosen one of his sons to be king. And I read that phrase, I've chosen one of his sons, means literally, I have seen a king. I love that. I love how he says it that way. I've seen a king. Go to Jesse's, I have seen a king. And it introduces this theme of seeing that occurs over and over again in the passage. You're going to find this out. So verse 4, Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, do you come peaceably? All right. When a prophet shows up in your doorstep in your city, usually that's not a good thing because he's coming to just pronounce judgment over you. And I kind of feel for Samuel here because as a pastor, you're kind of a buzzkill to all the parties and everybody. You show up, you're like, what's he doing here? So I understand that. So they said, are you coming peaceably? And he says, peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So Jesse and his sons, they arrive at the sacrifice. Then immediately it says, when they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. So what happens here is Eliab walks into the room, and instantly, Samuel is sold. He's ready to uncork the horn of oil. He's ready to anoint him and make him king. Why Eliab? Samuel's got all these other sons. Why does he choose Eliab just from the drop? Well, 2 reasons. Eliab is the firstborn. This was a culture which all power and authority, all the privilege passes through the firstborn. Right after that, you're kind of out of luck, but it always goes through the firstborn. Eliab was the firstborn. The second thing you're going to see a little bit later, it doesn't show up right here, but it does reveal itself in a couple of verses, is his stature. He is physically taller than the rest of them. And this was important because a man's appearance, specifically his height, was a chief qualification for leadership. Why is that? We'll go back to what the people said before. We want a king. We want a king that will fight for us, that will defend us. Height was a sign of strength and power. If you were tall, you were considered to be a formidable warrior. So Eliab comes in, he checks both boxes everybody's looking for. He's the firstborn and he's tall. So at first glance, he seems to fit the bill. By appearances alone, Samuel thinks he's qualified to be king. And we think, well, that's just silly. It's silly, but it's still the standard. We can't get on Samuel too hard. You know why? Because we still do this. We judge a person's potential based on how they look. We judge a person's worth on their appearance. You're like, I don't do that. We all do that. You meet someone brand new. Before you've ever exchanged words, you've made an assessment and a judgment about what they're all about their worth. You know, you form an opinion. Sociologists tell us that 93% of that opinion is based on what you see alone. You're making judgments based on the appearance of people. We all do it. And exactly what Samuel's doing once again. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't look on his appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. Then we get to this key verse, a verse that you might be familiar with. You might have heard this before. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And we think, that's great. We love to hear that. But we don't do it. We haven't gotten any better at this than Samuel was. We have not progressed out of this. We continue to fall for the insignificant. We continue to succumb to the superficial. Why is that? I read somewhere that, it's a quote that I hope I don't mess it up, but it's our culture, the world we live in, deeply habituates our souls to look at everything in the exact opposite way that God does. That it's almost we can't hardly help ourselves. We look at things the opposite way that God does. We see things not in the way that God sees them, but the way we see them. And I want you to see how, when you say it's deeply habituated, it's like a well-worn groove in our thinking that we have a hard time getting out of. I want you to see how deeply this goes, how deeply this affects us. And I want to use Samuel again as an example. If you go back to Saul and how Saul began his reign as king, you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 9. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Achish, a man of wealth. He had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the other people. Listen, from that description alone, if there was any man in Israel who seemed more made for the throne, it was Saul. No one came close. He was a prototype of royalty, came from a wealthy family, which means they had connections, they had influence, they had power, they had privilege. He had all of these things, right? Not only that, he was a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people more handsome than he. And then on top of that, from his shoulders upward, they didn't just say he was tall. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than everyone else. The next tallest person in his country came up to his shoulder. He dwarfed everyone. He walks into a room and the room gets quiet because he's so big, he's so handsome. And do you remember in Toy Story? You're like, whoa, this took a turn. Okay, Buzz Lightyear shows up with the little green aliens, right? He walks among them. They're all kind of right down here, and they're like, ooh. You remember that scene? That's what I see. I think about Saul walking into a room of his fellow Israelites, and they're like, ooh. Because he's so impressive. He's so imposing. According to man's criteria and the world's value system, Saul was the perfect choice. And he should have been. If that criteria mattered, if that value system counted, he should have been a stunning success. But he was a terrible failure. And you look at that and go, well, yeah, but who's to blame here? God made him king, right? Didn't God choose him? Didn't God anoint him? Well, sort of. So you go back and you look through the chapters 9 and 10, it seems that way. But why did God allow him to become king of Israel? I read that Saul's name actually means asked for or requested. And that's what was happening. Remember the people asking for a king. And then later on, when Samuel is giving his farewell address to the people, he goes back and refers. Do you remember Saul that you asked for? He says it a couple of times. You asked for him. You asked for him. And when you kind of put all that together, it suggests that Saul was allowed to be king. Saul was chosen to be king, not according to the Lord's standards, but according to the people's standards. Basically, they were saying, we want a king, and this is what we want in a king. And God says, okay, I'll give you the exact king you're looking for. I'll give you the king you're longing for. And he gave them what they wanted. He gave them the king they wanted. And in doing so, he gave them the king they deserved. And despite the fact that Saul was a royal failure, Samuel still mourns for him. Do you see that? He's crying for him. He's grieving him. Now here, look at what happens. I told you, I want you to see how deep this groove is in our minds. His tears for Saul have barely dried. Look what happens. Eliab strides into the room, tall and regal, moving on a cushion of arrogance. And Samuel instantly is smitten. And he doesn't ask any questions, doesn't look over his resume, doesn't check his references. He just jumps to the conclusion based on what he sees alone, just the appearance alone, that the Lord's anointed is before him. This is how deeply ingrained this is in all of us. What Saul does is what we all do. Despite what has happened, he doesn't learn his lesson with Saul. Samuel sees Eliab, and he falls right back into the old familiar pattern. Despite the pain and the suffering and the trouble that Saul has caused, it doesn't occur to him. Despite the tears he just shed over him, Eliab walks into the room, and he thinks he sees the king. See, that's what we do. We look, but we don't see. It's like we live in a perpetual magic show where our eyes are constantly distracted by the thing the movement, the things that dazzle. But we are always looking away from the things that are really important. And so the people saw Saul, handsome and tall, and they were impressed. Samuel again looks at Eliab, and he's blown away. But God said what? I have seen a king, and it's not him. So there begins this procession of the sons of Jesse. Jesse calls Abinadab, made him pass before Samuel. Neither the Lord has chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by. He said, neither the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. None of these sons. God has not picked any of these sons. And Samuel has to be confused. Like, what are we missing here? And so he says to Jesse, are all your sons here? And Jesse says, well, there yet remains the youngest. But behold, right? Forget about it. He's keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send it to him. We're not going to sit down until he comes here. And he says, do you have any more sons? And Jesse says, well, there is the youngest. And the word there, youngest, was actually not just an indication of his age. It was a demeaning statement about his status. He was saying, his own father was saying, well, yeah, there is the youngest, there's the smallest, he is the lowest, the least, the last. He was the runt of the litter. At this moment, David is the epitome of insignificance. His own father was so dismissive of him, he doesn't even call him by name. Did you notice that? And no one at the party even misses him. He's so inconsequential. His presence was not even missed at the party. No one expected David. No one saw David coming. Truth is, no one saw David at all. Because where David was in his culture, with his birth order and where he was in the shepherd's field, all these things, he was practically invisible to everyone. But not God. No one else saw him. But you know what God said? I have seen a king. And he says to him, for the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That's the way it always works. See, it's our habit. Our habit is to look at the world in the exact opposite way that God does. But here's what God does. God's habit is to work in ways that are completely opposite to the world. This should not surprise us. This was a world that was set up for all power and privilege to pass to firstborn men and fertile women, right? For all rights and status and worth, just to go through a certain path. But over and over again, not just in this story, but throughout all of Scripture, God does what he does. He accomplishes his plans through younger sons. He advances his purposes and his mission through barren women. God deliberately chooses girls that no one wants and sons everyone who had forgotten. He is always upending the world's system of values and standards. So they sent for David, and they brought him in. And it says, now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Because the brief description here is he's ruddy. What does that mean? Some people actually believe, and I'm not one to argue, that David had red hair. I think that's so accurate. Red hair, beautiful eyes, handsome, right? You look at, wait, time out. Didn't we just say that Saul was chosen because of his appearance? And here we are, we're talking about David. He walks in, and yeah, he's the least of them all, but we're still talking about his appearance. Ruddy in appearance, beautiful eyes, handsome. Isn't this a contradiction? No, it's confirmation. It's confirmation that appearance has nothing to do with it. Never has, never will. And in some ways, it's kind of a stroke of genius on God's part. See, because on the one hand, you have the shining example of David, and on the other hand, you have the catastrophic failure of Saul. But you know what they both have in common? They're both handsome. David is good looking, Saul is good looking. But what God is saying is that David's appearance has nothing to do with his success any more than Saul's appearance contributed to his failure. The point is, they're both handsome. One's a success, one's a failure, because appearance is a non-factor. Appearance is wholly irrelevant. How someone looks has nothing to do with the quality of their heart. So David steps into the room, and God says, there he is. And Samuel steps forward, and he uncorks the horn. He turns it out over the boy's head, and the glistening liquid fills his curls, his beautiful red curls, right? And sweet fragrance fills the room. If it's not clear to everyone else, it is to Samuel. The runt of the litter, the one that no one remembered, would one day become now the ruler of the nation that no one would ever forget. So what's this teaching us? Well, we could say, well, surely it's teaching us that David was just a better man than Saul. Was he? Truly? I mean, you look at them both, right? We follow David throughout his life, and we're going to see that David, he does terrible things. David commits horrible sins that unleash excruciating consequences over his life and the life of his family and even his nation. What was it that set David apart from Saul? What set David apart from Saul was not the absence of sin, but it was an abundance of character. How do we know character? How does character reveal itself? Character reveals itself primarily in two situations. When we win, when things are going good, and when we sin, when we mess up. That's how character reveals itself. Let me show you a couple of examples. First, Saul. He wins. Chapter 15, God instructs Saul, you're going to go fight the Amalekites. And so Saul goes under God, he obeys God. They engage in battle. They win this great victory. Samuel shows up a little later. He's asking for Saul. Where's Saul? Where's Saul? Where's Saul? And you know what they say? Saul has gone up onto Carmel, a high place on top of a mountain, and he's set up a monument in his own honor. He worships himself. He takes full credit for the victory that God gave to him. When you win, right, are you taking the credit for it? Because that's exactly what he does. This is his character exposed. What does David do? How does David win? How does his character show through when David wins? Well, there's a moment after Saul's death where all the tribes and the elders of Israel come together and they swear their allegiance to David. He now has this whole army, and David goes for broke, right? He goes big time. He goes, let's take Jerusalem. Well, problem was Jerusalem was considered to be impenetrable. You didn't just attack Jerusalem. I mean, the Jebusites occupied Jerusalem, and when he showed up with his army, the Jebusites said, you're not going to get in here. Even the blind and the lame could fight you off, right? Because the strength of the fortress was such that even the blind and lame could defend the fortress. And then the very next words, nevertheless, David captured the fortress. And how does David respond to this stunning, unexpected, miraculous victory? David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel. He exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. He says, it's God gets the glory. God gets the credit. I didn't do anything. God is the one that is doing this. Character shows up when you win, but it also shows up when you sin. So Saul had clear instructions when he said, God says, you're going to go fight the Amalekites, but you can't take any plunder for yourself. No gold, no livestock, leave nothing alive. You're like, that's kind of harsh. But the point is, God is saying, you cannot enrich yourself and better your position by doing my mission. But the temptation was too great. He leaves some people alive. He keeps the best livestock for himself. Samuel shows up to confront him on his sin, and he walks in and goes, what have you done? He goes, I did exactly what the Lord said, right? Sounds like a teenager. I did exactly what you said, right? He throws up this defensive nature. I did exactly what the Lord said. He goes, then why do I hear the cows mooing or, in the field? And then you know what he says? Well, the soldiers brought them. So what he does is, in his sin, what does he do? He doesn't take responsibility for it, doesn't confess it, doesn't own it. He takes the soldiers who just laid their lives on the line for him and he throws them under the bus. He shifts the blame for his responsibility, for his sin, onto someone else. That is a man without character. David later in his story, the most heinous sin, commits adultery, has the husband of the wife essentially murdered to cover up his sin. Nathan, another prophet, confronts him. And what does David do? He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't shift blame. He doesn't offer excuses. He just says, I have sinned against the Lord. He owns it. That's character. It comes out when we win. It comes out when we sin. It sets him apart. Well, that's all well and good, but I'm not trying to be king. What does character have to do with me? Well, character allows us to have what we all really want. Really? What is that? Happiness. Now, I want to be clear here. Character doesn't make us happy, but it's character. When we have real character, character is what guards our happiness. It protects it. Character insulates it, and it puts it in a place where circumstances cannot touch it. That's what character is. That's the value of character. It puts our well-being, it puts our security, it puts our peace, it puts our comfort, it puts all those things that make life great. It puts it in a place where superficial things cannot touch it. Fear and worry and anxiety and jealousy and envy and conflict, these do not come from a shortage of talent or creativity or beauty. If you go back and look at Saul was a man whose circumstances should have been the happiest person on the face of the earth, right? He was tall, he was handsome, he was rich, he was powerful. On the surface, he should have been completely fulfilled, totally happy, but over time, what happens? His life comes unraveled. He's paranoid, he's tormented. In the end, he's physically broken, he's mentally unstable, and he takes his own life, even though he had everything, every box that the world says you need to be happy. He checked all of them, but in the end, he is a shell of a broken man taking his own life. He had it all, but what he didn't have was character. And so how do we find it? Where does character come from? Well, character's developed in us. It's developed over time. And I think we get a clue from David. Where does David's character develop? Before he became king, what was he? He was a shepherd. And as a shepherd, he was out in the field doing a thankless job with no one watching, putting his life on the line every single day, protecting the sheep under his care. Psalm 78, he chose David his servant. This is like God chose David his servant and took him from the sheep pens, from tending the sheep. He brought him to be the shepherd of his people, Jacob, of Israel, his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, with character. With skillful hands, he led them. While Saul was a man of standing, David was standing among sheep. Where does character come from? It comes from private places. It comes from the hidden spots. It comes from times of quiet and isolation. And we see this not just in David's life, we see it in Moses' life and Elijah's life and David's life and even in Jesus' life, that God never does anything in us or through us publicly that he does not begin privately. It's times of quiet, reflection, meditation. That's where character is built. It's built in those moments, not in just the crucible of stress of when we win or when we sin. That reveals character. But it reveals what we've invested in. So it's when we pull away. And why don't we do that? I mean, it's such a great benefit to us, because when you pull away and we quiet the world around us, right? We turn the volume down and we sit quietly and alone with the Lord. What happens? He exposes things in us and about us that we would rather not know or deal with. He makes us uncomfortable, and we have to face those things, those cracks in the armor, right? The points of pain. We have to face those things, deal with those things, work through those things in those quiet moments. Because it's in those things he prepares us, works in us, works through us. That's what we see in David. You know, he was the classic rags to riches story. One commentator I read called him the male Cinderella. And what's interesting is, in his world, no one saw him coming. But you know what's interesting? A couple thousand years later, what do we have? Jesus appears on the scene, and he was called the Son of David. Because what Jesus ultimately became, he came out of obscurity, out of poverty. He came and no one saw him coming. No one expected him. And he ultimately became a true and better David. Not just a king, as we said throughout the whole Mosaic series. Not a king, not the next king, but the king. Because he is that one king that we've all longed for. That David gave us just such a small glimpse of, just for a moment. But he became what David was laying the groundwork for, was foreshadowing for us. That's the point. So let's pray together, and let's just begin this journey through the life of David and see what he has to say, because he is so, so practical and powerful. I hope you come back for more. Father, thanks for this time. Thanks for the life of David, how it's recorded and kept and preserved for us so that we can wrestle with it, deal with it. Help us this week. Help us this week to pull aside, to pull away, spend time alone with you in quiet and solitude, to let you deal with us and us to deal with ourselves, to face the things we do not want to face, to consider the things we have tried to ignore, to do the work on our heart, the heart work in our lives that would make us uncomfortable, maybe bring us even a little pain. But God, use these moments spent in time with you, in quiet with you, in solitude with you, to shape us into the men and the women you call us to be. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.